start our session on the G20, on the transition from the German to the Argentinian G20 presidency. As you know, Argentina will chair the G20 process in 2018. Actually, the Argentinian G20 presidency already started on 1st of December this year. And also, as you know, the G20 process and the WTO process is closely intertwined. So the outcomes of the German G20 summit in Hamburg are relevant for the discussions here at the MC11, and of course the discussions at MC11 and the outcomes will be very relevant for the Argentinian G20 process. So this is the kind of a transition we would like to discuss today. Maybe first of all I should introduce myself. My name is Axel Berger. I'm from the German Development Institute. We organized in 2017 the so-called T20 process, so that's a think tank process which accompanies the G20 process, which develops policy proposals for the G20. And I worked as a co-chair of the T20 investment task force, and I'm happy to continue to co-chair this task force under the Argentinian presidency. So, from my perspective, obviously it's very timely to discuss the relationship between G20 and the WTO, as Argentina plays a very, very significant role in both processes this year and next year. Looking back at the Hamburg summit, trade policy along with climate policy was one of the most contested policy fields during the German G20 presidency. That's not because of the German chair wants it to be like that, but it's obviously a matter of a radically changing international environment with a US administration which took a number of different perspectives on a number of issues compared to previous US governments. So if you look at the communiqué that was adopted in Hamburg on trade, you will find a lot of things that are pleasing everybody or maybe nobody. So there's something for free traders, right? There's a commitment to keep markets open. There's a mentioning of the non-discrimination principle as being very important. The G20 pledged to continue fight protectionism. It pledged to support a rules-based international trading system, and it achieved a multilateralization of the dispute over overcapacities, in particular on steel. But obviously there's also something for the anti-globalists. So there's this mention of the importance of reciprocity. There's the mentioning of fair trade practices, whatever that means, right? And there's a mentioning of legitimate trade defense mechanisms, which are not considered as protectionism. So there's something in it for everybody, and obviously it reflects a very difficult negotiation process that took place in Hamburg and in the run-up to Hamburg. So what we are going to do today on this panel is to evaluate the outcomes of the Hamburg summit, obviously with a view to the ministerial conference happening these days here in Buenos Aires, and obviously also with a view to the summit, to the G20 summit in Buenos Aires in late 2018. We will not only focus on the G20 process in general, but we would also like to take a closer look at some of the issues that are of importance or that were of importance during the German G20 presidency and also previous years. So we would like to focus, for example, on investment facilitation, on digital trade, on the question of how trade and sustainable development can be better linked. And of course, we will also reflect on the challenges that lie ahead for the G20 in 2018. And I must say I'm very pleased and very happy that we have so many experts here on the panel who have been working on G20 issues for quite some time. So there's a lot of experience sitting here on the panel. So let me introduce the panelists in the order of appearance and in the order of the speeches. First of all, Simon Evenett. Welcome to this panel. Simon is a professor of international trade and economic development. He is also a coordinator of the Global Trade Alert. That's an independent watchdog of G20 trade measures. Simon has written extensively on trade policy in the G20 context. And we are very grateful that you will draw some lessons from the trade discussions during the German process, and that you will also reflect on the challenges for the Argentinian process. Secondly, we have James Zhan. James is a director of UNCTAD's division on investment and enterprise. And James has been a very influential figure in the trade and investment negotiations in the G20 for quite a number of years. And James will talk a little bit about investment facilitation and what the progress has been, and maybe also a little bit about the contentious issues with regard to investment facilitation. Our third speaker is Cristian Rodriguez. He's the head of trade and investment policy at World Economic Forum. Cristian is working on issues such as investment, digital trade, global value chains, and trade and environment. And Cristian will focus today on the discussion on digital trade during the German presidency, or digital economy in a broader sense. And he will reflect on the prospects on digital trade in the WTO negotiations and also the G20 negotiations. Then we have Moira Feil with us. Moira is a senior policy officer in the G20 G7 unit in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Moira also has a long-standing experience with regard to G20 discussions with regard to sustainable development. So she will reflect on the relationship between sustainable development and trade policy, in particular from the perspective of the Agenda 2030. And last, but certainly not the least, we will have Félix Peña with us. Félix is a director of the Institute for International Trade at the ICBC Foundation, and Félix is a member of the executive committee of CARI, that's the Argentinian Council on Foreign Relations, and CARI, together with CPEC, is playing an important role during the Argentinian presidency, as you will have the pleasure to manage and organize the T20 process, the think tank process. And Félix will talk about the challenges for Argentina during the 2018 G20 process. So again, I'm very happy to have this wonderful panel here, and I would now like to ask Simon to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Axel, for that introduction. Let me turn now to my presentation. I would like to look backward a little bit to the German G20 in order to look forward to the Argentinian G20. That's my goal. What I will do is lay out what I think were some of the more difficult challenges which happened in the German G20 presidency, and I should add, not because of they weren't German-created problems. They were problems Germany had to respond to, in my view. And they will, I believe, recur next year when the Argentines have to cope with these matters. And then I will also lay out some facts describing the scale of contemporary protectionism so that you can begin to see why these matters are indeed so controversial. So let me jump back. Sorry, Now, let me turn to essentially two flashpoints which were important in the G20 process in Germany, and I think will be important in the Argentinian case. And I think the first is, when we look at the German experience, was the Germans were lucky. They didn't have to persuade the G20 to renew fully the G20, the no protectionism pledge. That actually comes up for renewal next year. But the fight in Hamburg was over what constitutes protectionism. And now, amongst old trade policy hands, such as myself and Félix and others, we've always thought about whether trade defense counts as protectionism, okay? And this year, the G20 leaders decided that trade defense and trade remedy actions don't count as protectionism, and so they should be excluded from the monitoring. Now, this is unfortunate for the official monitors of protectionism at the WTO, because 3/4 of the measures that they find are trade remedies. And so you will see an immediate impact on the WTO assessments of the degree of protectionism. Now, of course, underlying this fight over what was protectionism is really a fight over whether protectionism is a good idea. And as we know, with the America First policies of the United States administration, they clearly take a different view than much of the rest of the G20 on this issue. And those, I think, differences in substance, which are on display here at MC11, and we saw that this morning with Mr. Lighthouse's speech, those differences in substance will indeed recur, I think, into next year. So the first big takeaway I have for you is that the protectionism question, the most painful question really for the G20, because as I'll show you, it is in the trade policy area their biggest failure. The most painful question, which is dealing with protectionism, is actually going to come back next year, because the renewal of the no protectionism pledge has to be agreed by the G20 membership. And I find it very hard to understand, well, very hard to see how the Americans will agree to that renewal unless there are some very substantial changes made to it. So I think that's the first big thing to watch out for next year. The second thing the Germans did, or had to try and tackle this year, was a growing dispute over overcapacity in key sectors, and Axel has mentioned steel. One could also mention aluminium. This is not a new issue. The G20 has dealt with overcapacity before. But this year there was a renewed impetus to try and show that the G20 was taking action. And of course, amongst the G20, there was a blame game as to who was responsible for the overcapacity. Now, at the Hamburg summit, a series of promises were made about a timetable for taking action, which would involve a conference organized by the OECD, plus commitments which were then going to be implemented and evaluated. Now, I must tell you that in the steel sector, we are well behind schedule on this, at least compared to the agenda which was laid out in Hamburg. It's not terribly surprising, because overcapacity issues are very slow to resolve. The OECD history in this area tells us that it can take decades, literally, to encourage countries to scale back overcapacity. So it was a bit ambitious for the G20 to think that they could do this in several months, but and we have fallen a bit behind schedule. And indeed, the recent G20 steel meeting in Berlin, I watched the press conference of it, and it would be hard to say that there is a meeting of minds on these issues. So that issue, I think, will recur next year, and we'll come back with, I think, greater vengeance. Another contextual factor which you should bear in mind when you think about the Argentine G20 presidency is the relationship between the timing of the Leaders' Summit and the US midterm elections. If the Leaders' Summit happens after the midterm elections, then maybe we can have a slightly more positive and constructive summit in this, or discussion on trade. If the Leaders' Summit happens before the US midterm elections, then given, I expect President Trump will try and fight on his nationalist credentials, there will be no room for compromise at the G20 on trade policy. And so I would look for the announcement of the timing of the Leaders' Summit for next year. I couldn't find a definitive announcement. And if it is before the US midterm elections, I think there are some pretty clear implications for what will happen in the Argentine G20 presidency. You'll have to deal with a very difficult United States administration. Now, the last thing I want to do in the remaining 1 or 2 minutes I have is to show you some facts on the spread of protectionism. I put on the note here, I'll show you some facts as if they mattered. I'm not convinced that the G20 works on a particularly factual basis when it comes to protectionism. There seems to be a high level of denial amongst many of the governments. They find the facts I'm about to show you extremely inconvenient. And this, of course, is because they've taken the position that protectionism is under control and that the organization which is meeting on the other side of the street has got it under control as well. So let me show you some facts which arise from the data collection exercise that my team does out of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And what we have done is to take all of the liberalizing trade measures that we find and all of the trade distortions and try and calculate how much trade is associated with each of them and then express the amount of trade as a share of G20 exports. So that's what we want to do, to give you a sense of the scale. Okay? And here is the chart which shows you what is the proportion of G20 exports that face either trade distortions or trade reforms. And you can see the good news is, down at the bottom, that by the year 2017, 23% of G20 exports have benefited from some type of trade reform, which is still in effect from the beginning of the crisis. And that's good news. That number has crept up over time. But of course, it's swamped by the top half of the chart, which is look at the increase over time in the share of G20 exports which face some type of trade distortion in markets. And this is now over 80% on our calculations for the G20 countries. And we can see this number has progressively increased over time from 37% onwards. And I will show you which policies are responsible for that in a couple of slides. So first, the scale of the protectionism problem is significant. And I think this is one of the reasons why some countries have picked up on this as a concern. And of course, one of the least we should be trying to keep the pressure on the G20 to do more about this. You can break down those numbers I just showed you by the number of trade distortions that each G20 export faces. And what we have is each G20 export could face 0 trade distortions, 1 trade distortion, 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 or more. And you can see over time that the proportion of G20 exports that face just 1 or 2 trade distortions has remained relatively constant. And more G20 exports have been hit 3 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, or 11 or more times. So the chart that I showed you on the last slide understates the amount of repeated protectionist harm that is building up into the system. Now, this type of careful aggregation, we are the only organization which does it, okay? And I think what it shows is the scale of the problem and why we need to take this matter seriously. Now, what are the policies which are most responsible for this? This is where there is a very interesting finding, and that is that despite all the effort or the attention by the Americans and others on trade remedies as not being protectionism, it turns out that those trade remedies cover so little trade, they don't even show up on this chart. Okay? What this chart shows is how much exports from the G20 are affected by different types of trade distortion. Subsidies for bailed out firms, mainly farmers and manufacturers, government procurement measures like Buy America, or import tariff increases, which is the 1930s form of protectionism. So those are the lower 3. What very few people realize is that the biggest action in the last 10 years has been by governments using state incentives to increase exports, principally through national tax systems. Okay? When the history of this period is written, it will not be written about import restrictions. It will be written about export mercantilism. And that is exactly what has been going on in the last 10 years. And I just want to refer you to the G20 pledge in 2008 that we will refrain from implementing WTO inconsistent measures to stimulate exports. This chart shows that just how much the G20 has violated this provision. Okay? And we can break them down into which countries are responsible, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see here we have a trade distortions problem. It's not on the import side mainly, it's on the export side. We have countries essentially subsidizing their own exporters to steal market share from other firms, from other countries' firms. And that's the nature of 21st century protectionism. Now, you would not know this if you followed the G20 deliberations, unfortunately. Again, this is why I have argued that they're somewhat fact-free in their approach to this. Okay? Now, the last point I want to leave you with is something a little bit worrying, and this is a chart which shows you the number of times American commercial interests have been hit by G20 members and non-G20 members. And this chart shows you the number of measures which are still in force at the end of each of these years. So it actually does not count measures which were put in place temporarily and removed. Okay? What you can see in this chart is that at the end of 2016, there were nearly 2,500 policy interventions by the rest of the world that hurt American interests, and just under 2,000 of them come from G20 members. This has one very important implication. If the Americans go looking for examples of foreign protectionism that's hurt them, they will find them. The idea that the rest of the world is innocent is wrong. It's ridiculous. It's factually incorrect. Okay? So this is what we are exposed at. Now, why are we exposed at this? For one simple reason, that our friends at the G20 thought it was smart to go around telling everybody that protectionism was under control when it wasn't. The risk is that you end up having a rogue member of the G20 who starts pointing out the truth. And the truth is that many countries have broken this protectionist pledge, including the United States. Now, I personally wouldn't want any of this protectionism, but if we're going to put the facts on the table, you can see why Mr. Lighthizer and others stand up and say what they said this morning. Okay? We have all been talking a lot of nonsense about protectionism for far too long, and it's about time to get serious about it. Unfortunately, I don't think the Argentine presidency will be able to do much about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, Simon, for pointing out some flashpoints that will be on the Argentinian agenda, and thanks also very much for providing us with solid empirical data on the discussion on protectionism, and pointing out how huge the challenge actually is that the G20 faces in this area. Let's now continue with three presentations, three inputs on with regard to issue-specific areas, and I would like to ask James Zhan to start the discussion and focusing on the topic of investment facilitation, which has been on the agenda at least since the Chinese presidency. It played a role during the German presidency. So, James, give us your perspective, please.
Thanks, Axel. Thank you for inviting me here to talk about this, what I called bittersweetness, the experience of bittersweetness working with G20, provide a backstop in the area of investment. It has been almost 10 years now, since 2008, that at that time the G20's work upgraded to the summit level, and UNCTAD, OECD, and WTO, three organizations were invited to be the agencies to provide backstopping on trade investment. And every year since 2009, we provided report to G20 on investment protectionist measures, which is monitoring the G20's policy developments in this area. And it used to be a quarterly report, and now it is twice a year for the report on the investment protectionism from our side, and trade protectionism by WTO. I would say at this stage, G20's work in the area of investment is at a crossroads. And this is the second time it is at a crossroads over the past almost 10 years. I think the first wave of the height of G20 was basically in 2010 to 2012. At that time, that there was the high-level development working group was established of G20 during the Korea presidency, and then continued until now. But between 2010, 2011, that was the French presidency, and then 2012, the Mexican presidency, there was a lot of work within the group of development, high-level development group, the work stream. And there, at that time, the G20 had some good work in the area, like criteria for assessing the impact of investment on development, including low-income countries, corporate social responsibility standards in global value chains, and also principles for responsible investment in agriculture. So these are the good work of G20 at the time. So that was for 3 years. They made achievements and with some tangible results, instruments that came out. And afterwards, this development working group, or the work stream, drifted to some development issues in general and drifted away to environmental issues, to green investment, or financing for long-term investment. It's more of soft, less instrumental, but more of discussion type of work. And that continued until the Australian presidency. Let's start on infrastructure. But even for that, I didn't see any concrete outcomes in terms of policy instruments related, or we call the soft instruments. And then the G20's work in the area of investment was at a crossroad. But last year, when G20, during the China's G20 presidency, and they had some very important achievements. That is the G20 guiding principles for investment policy making. It's called G20's principles for global investment policy making. And it was the first time in history that the major developing countries, and the economies in transition all together agreed on a set of guiding principles that covers not only investment facilitation, but also investment liberalization, protection, investment treatment, and promotion. So it's the full range of issues that are dealt with. And sustainable development as a major principle that cuts across all the other principles. So that was a major achievement. It was very difficult, but they made achievement. But this year, during the German presidency, there was tremendous difficulties. The agenda items was investment facilitation. So the member states of G20 on investment facilitation worked very hard on that, and had 3 sessions of the working group in the trade investment work stream. And in fact, in the midnight, they agreed on the text. The text was clean. But the next day, there was the problem of a trade work stream because of the trade investment working group. And at the trade working group, there was 2 papers or 2 outcome documents tabled. And there was major G20 members suggested to combine the 2 into 1, and then later on to say that you condensed into 2 paragraphs. That was on trade, and with the 2 paragraphs, they could not agree on the 2 paragraphs. So they agreed on 1 paragraph. Eventually, it was not so helpful. And at the very end, there was basically the decision of the work stream is that no outcomes. So this year, in the trade investment working groups, there was no outcomes, even though that the text on the trade, on the investment, which is called G20's investment facilitation package. The text was clean. I was the facilitator of the negotiations in and out, including sitting with the members over the night. So that's very frustrated. At the very end, you are not able to see the text, but the text is a clean text. So that's the status, what I can see. And throughout the years, I was fortunate to be the facilitator for a number of presidencies in delivering all these outcomes. Facilitator means helping to draft the inputs, provide the information, and then sit sit with the members to negotiate the text and outcomes. And this year is really, really difficult, I can tell. Where do we stand? In a sense, I see there are still a few issues, or I call it unfinished agenda, that could be dealt with G20. One of the issues is what Simon mentioned, trade and investment protectionism. Luckily, this year, the G20 agreed that that agencies, organizations continue to report to G20 on trade and investment protectionist measures. Basically, it's policy developments. But this output is not part of the trade and investment working group. Is kind of our input supposed to be for the Sherpa's track. So that's why it survived at the last minute, despite the fact there was heated debate on to continue or not to continue. And for the time being, it continues. And the last 3 weeks ago, we submitted our report to the G20 Sherpa before the handover. And I think we'll continue to do the periodic report, meaning twice a year. Now, Simon mentioned the report that his perspective, yes, I think he's right. And my perspective is that when we do this G20 investment protectionist report, we look into G20's new policy measures putting in place that they introduced. What G20 should ask us to do, and we should do, in addition to the new policy measures introduced by G20 members during the period of reporting, are those measures, or not measures, basically how G20 implement their investment policies, particularly at the stage of screening, monitoring, and approval of investment projects, including merger and acquisitions. That part is not covered because it's very difficult to judge that international organizations to pass on judgment to see which that individual investment project or cross-border merger and acquisition deal is blocked is because of protectionism or not. There's the issue of national security. There's an issue of public interest. So trade and investment protectionism, in particular investment protectionism, is a kind of thing like we see the eyes in the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. It's very difficult to judge. But to do the reporting, I think G20 can consider that expand our report to cover that part. That issue I raised at the G20 Sherpa twice. Now the other issues is, of course, the international investment treaty reform, this investment treaty regime reform. As you are aware that there's a multilateral trading system and a multilateral monetary system. There's no multilateral investment system. And the current international investment regime is highly fragmented, highly atomized, multi-layered and multifaceted, and consists of 3,340 investment treaties. And treaty-making pace continues very rapidly compared with other treaty-making field. But I think the pace compared with the previous years is slowed down now. Now the issue is that there are 2,500 investment treaties, bilateral investment treaties are in force, and these treaties are old generation treaties, that treaties concluded in the 80s, 90s, and the beginning of the century. And these treaties do not take into account of the paradigm shift, sustainable development factors. And when you look into these treaties, that you see that there hardly mention of sustainable development, and to see the policy coherence between the investment treaties and the public policies. You don't see these things in that. So there's a problem in these old treaties. And all these treaties bite. in a sense, if you look at all these hundreds of investor-state dispute settlement cases, 95% of the treaties are triggered by the old generation of treaties, for good or for bad reasons. So UNCTAD has advocated reform. G20 paid attention to it. And last year, it was one of the issues on the G20 agenda, the Chinese presidency. But due to the fact that they had to prioritize, they focused on guiding principles and then leave this agenda for the future. So that is one finished. Investment facilitation, I think time is not ripe. Maybe sometime later it'll be picked up and to continue to work on this investment facilitation. The other thing is the policy coordination, and that is very important among the G20. There are a lot of issues, horizontal and vertical coordination, meaning coordination between investment treaties among the countries, and also between the international investment regime and the national policies and national investment regimes. That coordination needs to be taken into account. Other issues relate to agriculture, perhaps responsible investment in agriculture. There are things that needs to be done. And then to take into account of the latest development of global value chains put into a kind of a digital world, a digital age, how that value chain has been evolved, and what are the impacts to developing countries, particularly those developing countries and SMEs, which are the suppliers to the value chains. So these are very important issues. Specific issues to be dealt with by Argentinian presidency, I think Argentinian presidency has already something in mind already. We had a kind of video conference to discuss all these issues with the presidency, but I think it should be the G20 presidency to announce that, not for me to say here. There's something very interesting that they are considering. I think soon they will announce that. Now, just to conclude, I have 1 minute, I know, yeah? So to conclude, I would say that G20's work in the area of investment is at a crossroad. There's a need for political will, and for the time being, it's not so strong. And timing is important. Simon mentioned this midterm election. The other factors in the area of investment is that the most powerful country is now at the stage of reviewing its investment positions, reviewing all these investment treaties they have signed, and to see whether they serve the best interest of the country. And they are in the process of the negotiation of the NAFTA. So if we want G20 to do something meaningful, that develop the instruments, then we have to wait until US is ready, meaning they have their new models coming up. Either it is the investment chapter of NAFTA or out of their review process. Otherwise, they do not have a position, they are not in a position to take on anything in the G20. So this is the timing issue, and the last one is, for G20 is always a soft approach. It can't be a hard approach in this area. Even that, it depends whether it's instrument-oriented or it's consensus building only. That's the question. But it's soft. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James, for this very fascinating insights into the G20 negotiations on investment issues, on investment facilitation in particular, and also thanks very much for pointing out some of the issues that are on the horizon, at least when it comes to investment. We will now move forward, move on to another topic area, and we would now like to focus on digital economy, digital trade, also a topic that was high on the agenda during the German presidency. And Cristian will talk us through the developments in this area and also the prospects for the Argentinian presidency.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Axel, for the invitation. Very glad to be here, and I think I have the burden of getting your moods up after a very gloomy, but realistic, of course, outlook from the investment side, and I think I can do that. I think on the digital trade side, news were a little bit better. Advancement this year was, I mean, Germany put a lot of firepower and will on the digital economy, in particular the digital trade side, and I think that to an amount what was possible this year, it went quite well. The leaders' declaration had, paragraphs such as, constructively engage in WTO discussions, support free flow of information and others. So I think it was even on the language as expected, or even a little bit better. But the big news wasn't really in Hamburg for digital trade. The big news were actually in Düsseldorf in April 6 and 7, where the G20 and digital, there was a ministerial meeting of digital-related ministers, which came up with the Düsseldorf Declaration that was basically endorsed later on at the summit. So the components of that declaration are the declaration itself, and then a roadmap for digitalization, which a number of points, that's, talking about infrastructure and competition and consumer protection and others. We're not directly there. I mean, they are, of course, trade-related, but not specifically to this presentation. Something on digital skills and actual G20 priorities on digital trade. Those ones, as framed by the declaration, were specifically covering the areas of measurement, so looking for better measurement on digital trade, and this is going to be led by the OECD and a number of other agencies. Also on international frameworks, the recognition and the pledge to engage constructively with the WTO on electronic commerce, recognizing the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, is very useful for electronic commerce, and strong endorsement for the G20 Argentina and the G20 going on to re-engage on these issues. The third one is on the development dimension of digital trade, also to pledge to intensify action to involve LDCs and other developing countries in digital trade, talking again about infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, capacity building, and so on. But really, the news on digital trade weren't only on these priorities, but also on the general declaration. There are other parts which were very relevant to it. Again, pledges on the Düsseldorf Declaration on the freedom of expression and the free flow of information, ideas, and knowledge being essential for the digital economy. Paragraph 24, very important on international standards, on the development of use of international standards for tech products, and calling for consistency with WTO rules, which was definitely relevant, and particularly important, I think probably the most important, paragraph 26 of this declaration on the support for free flow of information, of course, while respecting domestic and international legal frameworks for privacy and protection. And we'll talk about the data flows and data protection a little bit in a minute now. There's a number of good aspects for good outcomes for this. The continued engagement with WTO, talking about measurements, standards, etc. But of course, some areas also for improvement, right? In particular, I would say there's a need for deeper knowledge sharing between the trade policy community and the other international policy forums on economic. When you work on digital trade, you normally hear people talking about like the trade guys, and the internet guys. And I think that those communities need to come forward and come together. As an example, actually, in less than an hour from now, the World Economic Forum and the WTO and the EWTP, Electronic World Trade Platform, will be launching a private-public dialogue collaboration series and an initiative to foster electronic commerce. It will be Director General Acevedo, Jack Ma, and Richard Salmons from the forum announcing this I think public-private collaboration institution or tool to provide space, to deliver capacity building, dialogue, and also on electronic commerce. So I'm actually going to have to leave a little bit early this panel for that. So my apologies in advance. There's a bit of criticism from the B20 about getting more on Internet of Things, on artificial intelligence, on like distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, and others which are really little only touched upon but not really referred to. Of course, on data flows, there's I think the G20, if there's any global institution that it's capable of touching the very difficult issue of data flows, that will probably be the G20 at this level. Mark Wu Harvard professor just on an earlier panel was talking about the frightful three: data, privacy, and security. But I think definitely, you know, that it's clear that technology moves, you know, a lot quicker than the speed of trade remedies, and trade remedies that probably the DSU is not going to move at all very soon. But I think it's really an opportunity here for the G20 to find path for more cross-border enforcement cooperation. Maybe, you know, institutions like, frameworks like, for example, the EU-US Privacy Shield, you know, could be enhanced and broadened on a different form. But I think the G20 has a lot to say on this, on the data flows, on the data flow side. And finally, with this end, I think on the SME side, there could be a little bit more too. I think, of course, there's positive language on the SMEs, and there was a cross-cutting group on the SMEs in Germany, but more specific language and action towards, you know, the engagement on the SMEs and digital trade specifically would have been, I think, much welcome, and it's something that maybe Argentina, which I think has a very strong focus on small and medium enterprises going forward, can refer to. A parenthesis just on the WTO, Axel, because you asked me to say what's going on there, and as you may know, 18 papers tabled since MC10, a lot of activity on electronic commerce at the WTO, 8 recent proposals which are now being viewed here on the table, and very procedural, I would say. First of all, there's a big discussion on how this should be addressed at the WTO. Should it be a new body that will address these issues, because it's currently taking a look at General Counsel and others. But as you know very well, and you talked about Ambassador Leiheizer's comment this morning, I think nothing is safe for now. Even the moratorium on customs duties is not, definitely the renovation, which is kind of the lowest hanging fruit in every ministerial, is not a given. So I think we should be, it would be very, very positive, any kind of outcome on e-commerce at this ministerial, if not even the renewal of the moratorium. And I wouldn't be surprised if not an outcome on the multilateral area, there's some movement on a possible plurilateral area going forward from Buenos Aires.
Well, thank you very much, Cristian, for your overview. For your overview of the discussions on digital economy, digital trade during the German presidency, which I guess which we often forget, that actually a lot of things happened during the German presidency. A lot of movements happened. A lot of initiatives were moved forward despite the discussion on climate and on trade. So thanks very much for pointing that out. And we also moved on or moved forward during the German presidency on sustainable development. And but we also discussed the outcomes of the Hangzhou summit in the area of investment reform, which James referred to, which were very substantive. And the Hangzhou summit in 2016 also produced a very interesting outcome, and that's on the Agenda 2030. So the G20 referred to the Agenda 2030. It's committed to support the implementation of the agenda, and which I find quite interesting, there's a commitment that all work streams of the G20 should take the Agenda 2030 into account. So that's also a very relevant angle we have to take into account when we talk about trade, but that's now Moira's task.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you also for inviting us, and I really mean that. It's really important from government perspective to have these dialogues and to hear the newest data and also the criticism, and have a genuine discussion also with civil society. We take that very seriously. I'd like to take a little step back on the G20 sort of trade portfolio. Just briefly mention, the 3 points that already have been highlighted by the speakers. I think that the 3 elements that have been on the agenda since this topic of trade has been dealt with by G20 leaders in 2008, and protectionism has been discussed. There's different reports, more or less optimistic on how well we're doing. The investment point, James emphasized very clearly. I would like to add, especially during the time that this was also dealt with at the development working group level, that aid for trade was sort of really pushed forward. And here I think also we have some positive signs that I think more than 80% of all aid for trade comes from the G20 members who are contributing to that. It's about $23 billion US volume. And we would also add that the initiative around the compacts with Africa last year are also to be understood in an investment perspective. You know, less of a trade angle, but very important from our point of view. Finally, I think very significant is also simply maybe not so simply, the support given to the global multilateral trade system by the G20. I think anyone comparing the language in 2016 and from the Hamburg summit sees there's a different language chosen there, but nevertheless, this commitment was agreed by all G20 members in challenging negotiations. But I think another aspect is really quite important in these paragraphs, and that is really acknowledging the difficulties and the inequalities that have gone together with globalization. So this is for the first time we see G20 leaders, you know, quite candidly stating that there have been winners and losers, and that something needs to be done about that substantially and in the way of communications. And I think also this is an element where the trade ministers have also chosen rather differentiated language and managed to nuance that it's a complex area, and that if we want to get it right and want to make sure that people profit from the trade agreements we make, so forth, that we need to ensure that we have the policies in place. Another element that has been new, not under German presidency, but simply since the agreement of the SDGs, is the fact that the G20 have very strongly committed and recommitted to further align their work with the 2030 agenda. This was really quite a prominent sort of cross-cutting area of the German presidency, and we're also pleased to see that the Argentinian motto very clearly picks up this element as well. And this has different aspects. Axel mentioned the action plan on the 2030 agenda, which includes all work streams, which includes the trade work, the trade and investment working group outcomes, the work that's done in the finance track, you know, very traditionally very important and significant area of G20 work. And we have tried to this year, you know, really show what kind of actions have been taken by the G20 that promote sustainable development in the economic, social, and environmental sphere throughout its work, and with the new actions agreed this year. And again, we were encouraged by the signs that this kind of work will continue under Argentinian presidency. Another element that was only briefly touched upon that relates to trade is the work that has been done on global value chains. Again, I think here there was quite a respectable outcome this year, where the fact that social and environmental standards can really help integrate small and medium-sized enterprises worldwide into global value chains, that they can also deliver on this promise of inequality and, you know, decent work, not just any kind of work. And to my personal surprise, this is after 5 G20 cycles, 6 G20 cycles, even language on human rights was integrated in that chapter, which is not that typical for G20. So basically, I'd like to leave with a question to the panel and the audience. Is really, you know, from this broader perspective, we're talking about really these qualitative issues. What kind of trade, what kind of investments, what kind of growth is it that we want from the G20, and what are then the instruments that we need to have in place to achieve, and we would say, more sustainable pathway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Moira, for looking at the trade and investment discussions at the G20 from this angle of the Sustainable Development and Agenda 2030. I think there's still some room to align both agendas and bring these two communities together. But from my perspective, the G20 is a very good platform to at least attempt to have a bit more policy coherence. So we had now 4 very substantive presentations looking at the G20's commitment in various areas, and obviously now we are very interested to hear what this means for the G20 process during the Argentinian presidency, and also what the challenges are from your perspective, Félix, from the perspective of an Argentinian expert.
Well, thank you very much. I have the impression that we must have in mind that G20 is a process that in some way had at this level of the actual G20 a first step toward what is today in 2008. In that moment, the crisis was particularly of the financial system. And most of the first years of this G20 was concentrated in financial problems and also with trade, but particularly with protectionism. I think that now we are facing a new era of G20 in which the main challenge is in the field of trade governance, not financial governance. Doesn't mean that the financial agenda is not important. It means that the main issues today are in the global trade governance. It is sufficient to read the newspapers today or yesterday in different parts of the world, the main international newspapers, and you will see it very, very clear. The main question is what will happen with the global trade system that has been challenged, particularly by the United States or the actual government of the United States. I have the impression that linking the G20 of the Argentinian period with the G20 of the German period, we must have in mind what you mentioned about the final declaration in Hamburg. If you read the paragraph related with trade governance, it seems, at least for me, for many observers, very, very clear that it was not possible to achieve a consensus about what it was going to be included in the declaration. The declaration doesn't make a clear pronouncement about how to preserve, how to strengthen a global, rule-oriented global trade system. I have the impression also that in the beginning of the Argentinian presidency, that is today, yesterday, we can observe, particularly yesterday, that at least a group of countries, I would say mainly, particularly in the case of yesterday, Latin American countries, had been very clear in what different presidents said about the importance of the global multilateral rule-oriented system. And I have the impression that in some way, in the beginning of the Argentinian presidency of G20, it would be possible to say that in some way what Argentina is saying reflects the position of Latin American countries. And I think this is important in a way that could stimulate other countries to make a clear pronouncement about the importance to preserve, to strengthen the global multilateral system. It's very difficult to make any forecast in this sense, and the only thing is that it will be very, very, very difficult to imagine any of us as a journalist of a first-class financial newspaper or international newspaper in November this year, next year, that will not be concentrated in trying to see if the next summit could have a clear pronouncement with respect to the main question, that is, you want or you don't want to have a global multilateral trade system. And here is where I think that we should have in mind 3 points that in some way should be part of our discussions, not only governmental discussions, but our societal discussions about the global trade governance as a key element of global political governance. And if I relate global trade governance with global political governance, it's very easy to know why, because finally, if you take everything you can read of the year 1920 to 1939 of last century, it was very, very clear that the fact that there was no global multilateral trade system, one of the reasons that had some impact in what happens after, it was not the only reason. And that could explain why, after the war, the position, particularly of the United States, was very, very clear in the sense we need to have a global multilateral trade system, and that was the origin of GATT. I think that we have a first point to have in mind is precisely about the fragmentation effects in the international political system of a fragmentation of the global trade system. It's not only to know if we have a global multilateral trade system, but if the main point is to know if we have only one global multilateral trade system. And here I think we must be very, very clear. The idea of having several global multilateral trade systems doesn't come from the actual American administration. It was before the actual American administration in which we find strong elements of the idea of developing a parallel global multilateral trade system. And perhaps the clearest indication in this sense has been the TPP, the Transatlantic Partner Fellowship, partnership. Why the TPP? Because reading Article 24 of GATT and reading then the text of TPP is quite clear that the main question we could ask was who could be member of the TPP? Because according to GATT, that means WTO also, we should have a global multilateral non-discriminatory trade system, and only we could have preferential agreements following Article 24 through a free trade area or a customs union that will involve a group of countries that normally was thought to be part of a same geographic region. Now, when you analyze the TPP and you ask yourself, who could be member of the TPP, Article 4, Chapter 30 of the TPP says any Pacific region country first, or second, any country. That could be, that demands to be member and that is accepted by the other country. And here you have one of the main problems raised by the idea of a non-global multilateral trade system, that are the countries that had, even of the Pacific region, that had not been included as member of the TPP. And finally, I think the second point, that what we should have in mind this year is to raise the question and to obtain some answer to the question that was raised 2 days ago by from the European Union, in the sense, well, tell us which should be the reforms that we should include to the global multilateral trade system, because nobody has said which are the reforms that we should include. Within the presentation of some of the American officials, you don't have a clear indication what should be reformed in the global multilateral trade system. And that is something quite important to see if it is necessary and how we could reform the global trade system, only if we don't want to have parallel global multilateral trade system. In that case, we have fragmentation.
Tina, and then the next presidencies, Japan and Saudi Arabia, will have to deal with this very particular challenge.
The Troika.
And the Troika, yes. So G20 is very complex. It has a very complex agenda, and it also have a very complex negotiation process. So, your questions, please.
Hello. Peter Wooders with the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Geneva. Particularly taken by some of the remarks that Moira made and also Simon on sort of sustainable development and what issues we need to do going forward. I wonder if the panelists had any views of what progress can G20 make to do with disinvestment from fossil fuels, from the Powering Past Coal Alliance we saw at the last COP, from the announcement that was made this morning here at TSDS on that WTO should take a stronger role on disciplining fossil fuel subsidies. So very interested on what might...
How can be more effective the G20 if there could be is a problem of the governance structure, and if could be like a change of the forum, including more countries? What do you think? How should the G20 be more effective?
Thank you very much. And then
Teresa Carpenter from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. To Simon, I'm working with Jos Paulin and some students, one of whom is in the room using your global trader data, and they were puzzling over the legality of certain things. So I just wanted to understand that I had got it absolutely correct from you when you were speaking, which is that countries are using their national tax systems to substitute exports and therefore steal exports from others, steal market share from others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have an indication of who else would like to raise a question? Okay, let's have the Isa as a fourth question, and then we'll see whether we have another round. Okay.
Thank you very much for this very rich panel. I'm Isa from the OECD, and my question is to Simon. In order to keep up the interest in the monitoring mechanism, what kind of mechanisms can we have to ensure that we're really monitoring the right measures? For instance, James Zhan talked about facilitation measures, and we've also talked about updating this to keep up with the digital economy. So what mechanisms can we have to ensure that we are monitoring the right measures and the measures of the future? And also in that sense, in terms of, what do we do to strengthen the WTO, is there a role that TPR can take on to also have a more strengthened monitoring role? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have one question on fossil fuel subsidies. We have a question on how can the G20 become more effective. And then we have two questions to Simon first of all with regard to the methodology, but then also with regard to reform. So let's start with Simon, then we take the other two questions.
So I'll start with the question on fossil fuels, because I mean, it's a neat way of looking at trade distortions which also have potentially a very high sustainability impact. And this is exactly the type of win-win attack on protectionism that one could envisage the trading system being part of. I think what you're seeing is not much attempt to do that. I suspect what is the biggest driver of the level of those subsidies is actually two things: the oil price and the public finance constraints on governments, rather than trade disciplines. So this is an area where I think the trade disciplines have been take a second or third priority, unfortunately, because it could be a very nice way of hitting both the sort of the targets as well as trying to take forward the 2030 agenda. So I would endorse going after that. I just don't see much appetite for doing it in the near term. The question on how to make the G20 work better, if you think about what this forum is, it's a forum amongst big countries who do not want to sign binding accords. They do not really want to be held to account, which is why we have such weak protectionism monitoring by the international organizations in the first place. And you should know from the history of the 1930s, we didn't have a G20 in the 1930s, but we had a whole string of conferences amongst the great powers at the time, all of which pledged not to engage in protectionism, and that's exactly what happened. So history teaches you that this type of non-binding mechanism just simply doesn't work. So when the G20 was resurrected, those of us who had any historical perspective had limited expectations to start with, okay? And perhaps from that point of view, then you look at what's happened with the G20 now, at least with respect to protectionism, and you're not terribly surprised, to be frank. If you go back and read the history of the 1930s, there's not a single serious scholar who argues that the informal approach to international cooperation worked, which is why Félix is exactly right to suggest that after World War II, the Americans wanted a more formal approach. And this, I think that is the lesson of history. Some lessons we like to follow, some lessons we like to ignore. With respect to Teresa's question, yes, the claim I made was that there are a number of countries which have used their national tax systems to subsidize their exporters. They know who they are. We have documented hundreds of these interventions over time, but the ones through the tax system are probably a couple of hundred. There are other export incentives which are around there. And the purpose of these export incentives is very simply to shift market share in favor of domestic exporters at the expense of other firms. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. In the 1980s, we had a huge debate about whether or not the Japanese were doing exactly this, and we had essentially a literature about that. So this is just a matter of reliving, again, history for those of us old enough to remember it. And then to answer Isa's question, I think the most important thing to do, because commerce changes in its time, you have digital trade, we've heard from Cristian, you have cross-border commerce in many different forms, you need a definition of protectionism that is not contingent on the type of trade or on certain types of policy instruments. So it is wrong, therefore, to define protectionism as import tariffs and what you saw in the 1930s. Much better to define protectionism as any public policy instrument that treats foreign firms worse than domestic rivals, right? For which there is perhaps no health and safety justification. You might even want to add that last bit. But I think that's why you want to have a definition of protectionism which is not tied to any type of commerce or any type of public policy instrument. And if you do that, then you will not miss the new forms of protectionism. And that's exactly the approach we take at the Global Trade Alert.
Thank you very much, Simon. Moira?
Sure, yeah. I'll just pick up on the governance question. And Simon already mentioned the fossil fuel subsidies. You know, there's a commitment of the G20 on this, and the angle that we've taken at the development working group to discuss it is, of course, looking at, you know, low-income countries and what happens in their economies if suddenly fossil fuels are not subsidized, and has very strong connection to things like social protection floors. And so this is, I don't think particularly high on the agenda at the moment. I would agree with Simon, but there's some elements that relate to it that I believe Argentina might pick up. On the question of effectiveness of G20, well, I mean, it is a informal group. It is whenever I present to people who are not as knowledgeable about the G20 as you are, I always point out that there's not even a permanent website, which in these days gives you a bit of an indication of how informal and it is, and how much historical knowledge gets lost along the way. Of course, we have the fact that one member only needs to disagree and we don't have any outcome, which James clearly described. But I think an interesting element of effectiveness is, on the one hand, what I started to discuss earlier on the 2030 agenda and the point of policy coherence. So in this coordination mechanism, also in the coordination of international organizations and their approach. And a test, I guess, will be a little bit whether it really manages to shift from the crisis management mode to the more long-term perspective, which is a shift that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years of the G20. Although one might argue maybe now it's going to shift from the financial crisis mode to the trade crisis mode, if I understand Félix correctly. But this longer-term perspective, takes a very different kind of, different measure of effectiveness, I guess, as well. So we'll be looking out for that.
Okay. Just 2 points. One is about the protectionism. The other is G20's efficiency or expansion. The first thing is our OECD colleagues mentioned about this monitoring. Simon, you said the first thing we need the definition on protectionism. And that has been the discussion going on. And we started back quite a few years ago when G20 decided to ask OECD and UNCTAD to monitor the investment protectionist measures, so to speak. They put it there as a protectionist. But then when we discussed at that time with peer, and how do we define it, and how do we label individual measures as protectionist in nature, we really, really had a hard time. I don't think there's a definition of protectionism agreed anywhere, not in the investment field. I'm not sure it's in the trade field. For WTO, it's more distortion rather than protectionism. It's not labeled in that way, to my limited knowledge. So first, how do we define it? Second, how do you measure that? So as I said, it's in the eyes of the beholders. Because of that, it is extremely difficult for an effective monitoring mechanisms on the protectionism protectionist measures. Regarding the G20, I think you're absolutely right. It's more of a forum. There's no permanent secretariat. The OECD tried to do that in the past, successful in certain period of time, but difficult all the time. Otherwise, I think it remains a kind of loose group of countries. Expansion, if you do that, there are organizations that have universality in nature, and this is, of course, thinking initially is this kind of effectiveness and efficiency in coordination among the most influential countries. But my feeling is that they won't expand, and they tried to reach out, and for each presidency they try to reach out as much as possible. Starting with the Korea presidency, they appoint an ambassador at large for outreach at the ministerial level. So there are some presidencies over the years doing that, but it's less in doing so. That's what I see.
Thank you very much. Félix, you will have the last word because we have to wrap up our discussion.
I would make only a suggestion. I don't know if it's a suggestion or a crazy suggestion. But eventually, the idea would be to suggest the Troika, to ask the T20 and the B20 to give some ideas of how to improve the global multilateral trade system, which should be the reforms that we should introduce. And then a discussion in each of our countries, the 20 countries, about this problem of global trade system.
Okay.
No reaction?
Would be very good if the Argentinian government would do that, right? So
no, the Troika, I said.
The Troika. Okay.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
This should be collective action.
I see. So we will ask the German government. You will ask the Argentinian government.
I will ask.
We just have to look for a
Japanese
colleague, but I'm pretty sure we will manage to find one. So thank you very much.
But you could mention Cecilia Malmström. She asked the American government. And the American government will say, well, we should listen all the governments.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful and very insightful discussion on the G20, on trade in G20, and all these other issues that are linked to this discussion. Personally, I'm very much looking forward to the G20 process during 2018. Looking forward to work with all of you, basically, during this year. And yeah, thank you very much for being here.